Hello everyone, welcome to Dennis Saliba, Occult and Fortean, and in today's video I'm here to propose a working model of society based on statistics. The purpose of this live stream is not to be an academic live stream. We're not trying to be academic here, we're not trying to be a peer-reviewed study, so just take note of that. This is not a peer-reviewed study. But I just want to propose the following working model of society to explain a working theory that I have as to why reality presents itself the way it does. So just let me share screen for a moment. I'm going to start today's stream with the prevalence of psychopaths. So again, this is not a comprehensive study by any means. This is just a generic study. The AI figures suggest that estimates range to about 1% of the population. Other estimates say up to about 4.5%, and I tend to agree with the more conservative estimate on the channel. So basically 1 in 22 people. Globally, this is meant to be a global population. Psychopaths. There's a reason why we're getting towards these statistics. So let me share screen to a journal article here. The following article comes from the National Institute of Health, the National Library of Medicine, Frontiers in Psychology, published in 2021 on the 5th of August. And I'm only reading the abstract. I'm not going to read the full study, but I do suggest that you guys take time to look at this yourselves. So the prevalence of psychopathy in the general adult population, a meta-analysis suggests that basically in the meta-analysis of the 16 samples of adults totaling 11,497 people studied, up to 4.5% of the adult population is modeled to be the rough global estimate according to this study. So that's where the 4.5% comes from, of which the prevalence tends to be twice as high in males. Not in this study, but in other studies, twice as high in males as opposed to lower in females. So again, very conservative estimates. I don't believe by any way, shape, or form that the global estimate would be as high as 30%. Narcissism, if you were to estimate narcissism to be as high as 30% according to clinical research, then yes, I guess so. But the actual clinical definition of psychopathy, I doubt that it's 30%, at least on this show. So let's see. So this is not an academic source. We're going to go to CNBC. This was a study published on the 8th of April 2019 by Thomas Chamorro Premuzic. And basically he's saying that 1 in 5 business leaders may have psychopathic tendencies, according to this psychology professor. And from a study dating back to 2010, there were at least 3 times as many psychopaths in executive or CEO roles than in the overall population. But more recent data finds this figure to be upwards of up to 20%. So in short, in leadership and in powerful positions, psychopaths, because they have, I guess, a short-circuited form of empathy. The amygdala is a lower, basically there's less gray matter in the empathy circuit. The amygdala is less active. They tend to be better at more quick snap executive decisions, on the spot executive decisions, generally under higher stakes, whereby their relationship to fear or their actual feeling of fear is much lower than would be with, say, people from other pathologies. So I just thought I'd quickly highlight that for now. Let's see, those are individuals, but I'm only wanting to cover the statistic sides of things, not so much the anecdotes. That's not the purpose of the show, but I want to go back into some screenshots. So this screenshot here, this is World Health Organization data. This is a screenshot from my phone uploaded to here, but basically around 1 in 100 people worldwide, according to the World Health Organization, are believed to be autistic or on the autism spectrum, or ASD as it used to be defined, amounting to about 61.8 million people, 1 in 100 globally. So that's the other 1%. And the reason why I'm showing this is because I want to un-occult this from an occult lens. So people often think of occult as rituals or as a system of rituals, and to an extent you might be correct. However, if you're going to the Latin definition, occultare, if I remember correctly, so if you watch the lecture from Mark Passio, he covers the definitions of occultism from Latin. This is a verb meaning to conceal or hide. Now, what this implies is that there is also an unocculting process. So occult, Latin, occultare, basically meaning to conceal or hide in plain sight. And this implies that there is an unocculting process, or revealing, or unhiding and revealing. So there we go. Now, the purpose of the stream is to basically unoccult this the power structure of society. Because if you look at it from the autism and neurotypical lens, the structure itself seems a little bit incomplete, and I will get to the conclusion later. So, as we know, with anything in the spiritual or the occult, as above, so below, what happens within the cosmos, what happens within the spirit world, happens here on Earth in the 3D realm. That's what as above, so below means. And the other second rule is as within, so without. So basically what happens within the birth chart of your life and your destiny, as written from the cosmos, as within the spirit, so without the physical manifestation of the spirit will play out in the three-dimensional realm. That's what we're getting at here. And we're basically concluding in our little study here that the previous research in terms of the dynamics of the world and power dynamics of the world and society are not complete, and we're adding just one more little step. Here's another statistic here. So again, there's that 1 in 100 children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder as of 2021, and this estimate is around to be 75 million globally. So between 61 to 75 million globally, at least according to official statistics. Here's another screenshot here. Again, generic research. We're not going into hyper advanced research here. Numerous studies have indicated that a significant portion of individuals with autism exhibit above average intelligence, or at least a higher prevalence of individuals with autism tend to fall into the gifted to high range IQ by comparison of the general population. What causes autism? It's largely unknown as to what causes autism, but research tends to suggest that it is hereditary, mostly hereditary by nature and connected to the genetics of the parents. Hereditary, but not just hereditary, it's also the way in which certain genetic sequences are ordered and sequenced get activated in particular ways, which are otherwise quote unquote neurotypical or abnormal, I guess, if you're to use a more politically incorrect term, but non-neurotypical or neurodivergent. So this whole idea of vaccines causing autism itself, that would need to be investigated further, but this goes back to what I was saying about the nature of the genetic sequences, because this is an interesting study. It is not a conclusive study, but this is interesting. The following study comes from Clemson. Well, it's reported in Clemson News, but this is reported in Springer Nature. So Springer Nature came up with this study. And yes, this is a peer-reviewed study as well. But again, we're not concluding this. We're just merely stating that the source itself comes from Springer Nature. This is a peer-reviewed source, but the study itself is not wholeheartedly conclusive. Further study does need to take place, but there's the proof that Springer Nature is a peer-reviewed study, and it is heavily monitored by rigorous experts in their fields. So there's that. Now, the reason why I'm getting to this is because Neanderthals. I know this is going to be a very convoluted stream. I know, but hear me out. This is reported from the College of Science on the 17th of June, 2024 by Cindy Landrum. Study implicates Neanderthal DNA in autism susceptibility. Now, I don't like that title. I find that title to be a little bit misleading, but let's get into it. So, new collaborative research involving 2 Clemson University scientists has found that some genetic traits modern humans inherited from Neanderthals could increase a person's susceptibility to autism, but not in the way that you would believe. People with autism do not have more Neanderthal DNA than those who do not. Most modern humans have an average of around 2 to 3% of Neanderthal DNA. Instead, researchers from Clemson and Loyola University, New Orleans, discovered that some Neanderthal-derived variations are more common in people with autism than in the general population. So particular genetic sequences of Neanderthal DNA could be associated with autism. However, further investigation into this matter does need to occur. So this is not wholeheartedly conclusive, as I've said a few times. This is the first evidence that I'm aware of actually showing Neanderthal DNA is associated with autism, said Alex Feltus, a professor in the Clemson Department of Genetics and Biochemistry. The study suggests long-term effects of ancient human hybridization on brain organization and function. So not hybridization in the eugenics sense. He means hybridization in just the genetic sense, not the eugenic sense. Neanderthals emerged in Europe as far back as 400,000 years ago. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe from Africa as well about 54,000 years ago. The 2 species interbred. 14 years ago, the first whole genome sequence of the Neanderthal genome was published after scientists extracted DNA from the bones of 3 female Neanderthals that were discovered in a cave in Croatia. Since then, scientists have associated Neanderthal DNA to several human health conditions, including autoimmune diseases, prostate cancer, type 2 diabetes, skull morphology, depression, and protection against schizophrenia. That's pretty interesting. In this study, the researchers used data from publicly available databases, Simons Foundation Powering Autism Research Spark. Simons Foundation Powering Autism Research Spark. which includes, not concludes, autistic individuals and the unaffected sibling, genotype tissue expression, GTEX, and 1,000 genomes, 1,000 G. They found specific Neanderthal DNA markers were enriched in people with autism compared to ethnically matched control groups. The researchers, which included co-author Loyola University New Orleans professor, Assistant Professor Emily Casanova, and Rini Pauly, PhD, candidate in CU MUSC Biomedical Data Science and Informatics program, found 25 genetic markers linked to brain development that were more common in people with autism. I wonder how big this study was. I wonder if this is a meta study or a pilot study. Something tells me this is not a meta study, though, because it would say meta-analysis. Otherwise, I think this is more of a pilot study, but something that they've just recently found. But all people who have these Neanderthal-derived variations will not develop autism, Felter said. The hypothesis is not, did Neanderthals give us autism? It's that Neanderthals gave us some of the gene tweaks that give a higher susceptibility for autism. So the nature of the gene sequences tend to encourage the development of autism, but this is not a 100% positive correlation of Neanderthal DNA and autism. It's not. It's just a trend, a genetic trend of these markers tend to increase the rate of autism development from these sequences. Feltus continued, autism is a complex trait. It is controlled by many, many genes. A big part of what we do in my lab is to try to understand the level of complexity of the 60,000 genes in the human genome, how many genes are at play when you're developing autism or cancer or any other complex trait. We embrace complexity. We don't try to erase complexity. Feltus said the research could lead to earlier diagnostics, which I'm guessing that is most likely the aim. It's most likely the aim. Anyhow, let's go over to the next part of our stream today, the pineal gland and autism, because I have a theory that the reason why normies and conformies, as we like to call them, normies and conformies, not everyone, but in general, normies, conformies, and psychopaths and narcissists like to target those on ASD for two reasons. So the normies, conformies, but we're not saying everyone, psychopaths and narcissists like to target those on the autism spectrum disorder for one of two reasons. One, my working theory is that this is obviously to do with power politics and the power structure, which most of the leaders in charge, if you do study psychopathy, power politics or the power structure tends to favor the narcissist, the psychopath, and to some extent, possibly the sociopath, but more so power politics and the power structure favors the psychopath and the narcissist in particular, at least those two archetypes, pathologies, I should say. But I have a second working theory as to why people on the autism spectrum are targets for normies, conformies, psychopaths, narcissists, sociopaths, is because there is a spiritual reason. And that spiritual reason is nature is indifferent. Autism exists to help evolve the human experience. So there's the chaos element in existential philosophy. There is a spiritual reason for this. The proof is that autism exists because it is still part of the human experience, whether it's positive, whether it's negative. Hard to say, hard to quantify. The purpose of the stream is not to quantify that. but nature is indifferent. And in fact, the existence of autism itself in 3D reality is proof that as above, so below, as within, so without. What is within the spirit happens out in the physical realm, is that autism is evolving the human experience in general. The third reason, again, is another spiritual reason, part of my crazy hypothesis, full-on crazy conspiracy theorist mode, is that autism may correlate with higher access to DMT in the brain, otherwise known as the spirit molecule. And it is this very reason that connects to the first reason, that the higher natural access, with this, by this I mean you don't need psychedelics to, or if you are to scientifically verify this, some studies in autism show that the autistic brain has greater access to DMT naturally without the need for magic mushrooms and other psychedelics. But autism may possibly correlate with higher access to DMT in the brain, i.e., sometimes known as the spirit molecule. And then this is a threat to power politics and the power structure, which is designed and made by narcissists and psychopaths. Let's get into it with our future or further studies here. So again, the following article, and we're not going to read the full article, this is like a literal journal article, comes from PMC PubMed Central, the National Library of Medicine, Frontiers in Technology, updated view on the relation of the pineal gland to autism spectrum disorders by Tal Shormat and Nir Nasher. And you have what looks like a DOI number here. But in essence, the identification of biological features of autism is essential for designing an efficient treatment and for prevention of the disorder. So that's the rationale. The main function of melatonin, this is about sleep, is to link and synchronize the body's homeostasis process to the circadian and seasonal rhythms and to regulate the wake-sleep cycle. Therefore, pineal dysfunction has been implicated based on the common observation of low melatonin levels and sleep disorders associated with autism. In this perspective, we highlight several recent findings that support the hypothesis of pineal gland melatonin involvement in autism. Another common symptom of autism is abnormal neuroplasticity. This is when it gets interesting, such as cortical overgrowth and dendritic. So I don't work in cognitive science, guys. I don't have a cognitive science background. I'm trying. Dendritic spine dysgenesis. So basically the spine and the pineal gland within the spine either overgrows in a particular way, which affects the cortical part of the brain, which is also connected to the pineal gland. Here we synthesize recent information and speculate on the possibility that this is abnormal, that this abnormal neuroplasticity is caused by hyperactivity of endogenous NN dimethyltryptamine, DMT. The pineal gland was proposed as the source of DMT in the brain, and therefore our assumption is that besides melatonin deficiency, pineal dysfunction might also play a part in the development of autism through abnormal metabolism of DMT. This is a very, very interesting study. This is really, really interesting. So what they say is The pineal gland is a minute neuroendocrine gland located deep in the center of the brain, projecting from the posterior wall of the third ventricle. Its position on top of the third ventricle allows direct secretion of cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, in addition to the main route of the hormone secretion to the blood. Interestingly, an average excess of CSF fluid in the subarachnoid space was detected in autistic infants. Increase in CSF volume could have an influence on the concentration and effectiveness of its components delivers to the brain. Melatonin, acetyl 5-methoxytryptamine is considered as the principal hormone produced by the pineal gland, documented to link and synchronize the body's homeostasis in the sleep. We already read that in the abstract. Melatonin synthesis and secretion are mainly controlled by photosensory information that arrives from the suprachiasmatic nuclei. The SCN, control of the pineal gland, creates a strong circadian rhythm with higher levels of melatonin secretion in dark at night, negligible levels during the day, hence why we basically dream. It's connected to dream. Oh my God, it's connected to dreaming, that particular component of the brain. The link between autism. Okay, so that's describing the melatonin receptors. The link between autism and the pineal melatonin malfunction was first recognized after observations revealing how low concentrations of melatonin in individuals with autism, about 65% of ASD patients, have less than half the average values of melatonin. Moreover, the sleep disorder is one of the most common symptoms in ASD patients, with prevalence of 50 to 80 to 90 to 50% in normal children. Let's go further down, because it's not necessarily that part I want to look at. I want to look more at the DMT factor. Yeah, here we go. I'm going to go further down. You guys can read this in your free time. I'll include a link in the description. DMT and neural connectivity abnormalities in autism. So, as previously been suggested, that abnormal neuroplasticity, such as cortical overgrowth and dendritic spine dysgenesis, is a common neurological symptom in ASD. Abnormal activation of the mammalian target of this particular sequence has been proposed as the cause for these abnormal developments. In addition, it is suggested that the disruption of brain-derived neurotrophic factor BDNF activity through tyrosine kinase or kinase BTRKB signaling might play a role in autism initiation and propagation. So ASD was associated with an increase of the melatonin precursors serotonin and N-acetylserotonin, NAS. So basically, it's a pineal malfunction causing irregular gene mutations to regulate and possibly even produce less melatonin, which in turn increases activity or hyperactivity of DMT. Decreased activity of MAOA results in hyperactivity of DMT. So a serotonin and a melatonin, there's a lack of production, but in turn the brain, through the tryptamine, then circulates DMT throughout the spine a bit more than what would be, or more than average than what would be through like a so-called neurotypical person. So this particular receptor, 5H2A receptor, enhances the neuroplasticity of the brain, and the mild DMT psychedelic effect, which is natural. It doesn't occur through psychedelics. That synesthesia, sensory sensitivity, hyperattention to visual details, attraction to geometric shapes, hallucinations, and extended pupils can occur, which creates abnormal neuroplasticity, which is caused from dendritic spine well, one of the root causes are from dendritic spine dysgenesis and cortical overgrowth of the brain. High level of NAS can create hyperactivation, hypersensitivity to 5H2A, and hypofunction of SCART could result in elevated effective DMT. So they actually interact off each other. It was suggested that TKRB signaling plays a role in autism, and then we have hyperactivation of MTOR. Wow. It's a very, very technical diagram. I think the diagram is quite self-explanatory. I'm not going to go into too much of that. So basically, the spine and the endocrine system is not absorbing the DMT chemicals of the brain as efficiently. We propose that ASD may be affected by abnormal metabolism of endogenous DMT, which we saw in the figure anyway. That's pretty interesting. DMT is widely found in plants and animals, and although there have been indications for endogenous DMT in mammals, it's been indisputably proven that DMT is present in humans. One of the molecules being traced in order to identify the source of DMT is indolethamine and methyltransferase INMT, believed to be a pivotal enzyme in DMT production from the biogenic amine typtamine, and therefore can indicate the sources of DMT. However, INMT methylates and other substances, so these must all be enzymes, and therefore its presence can only imply DMT production. INMT has been detected in many tissues of the body, primarily the lungs, thyroid, and adrenal gland. Well, that doesn't surprise me. The thyroid, I think, is also kind of connected to this too. Nope. Due to popular trends or based on pure scientific reason, the pineal gland is the most studied area in the brain regarding DMT. Okay. That makes sense. The pineal gland was first proposed as the source of DMT in the brain since INMT had been found. Human pineal. All humans have this. 3 forms of endogenous DMT. There's DMT, 5-hydroxy-DMT, and 5-methoxy-DMT, so sub-enzymes of DMT in the rat pineal. Yet the role of DMT as an endogenous psychedelic remains controversial. The main reason for the uncertainty is that the only minute traces detected, I'm guessing that's a milligram. Oh, sorry, less than a milligram. I think that's a microgram to kilogram. So they're very, very minute, which are about 3 orders below the dose found to have psychedelic effects when delivered exogenously. So the study doesn't cover the studies of the psychedelic effects, cover consumption of DMT from magic mushrooms, not natural consumption from the metabolism from the various enzymes taken from the spine, in other words. There is a literature gap there. Link. However, there are it's even been considered negligible non-functional concentration product of tryptophan derivative of idolamide's metabolism. However, there are reports that link tumors to the pineal gland in pendicular hallucinosis and florid psychotic symptoms in ASD, some autistic behaviors such as synesthesia, sensory sensitivity, hyperattention to visual details, attraction to geometric shape, hallucinations, and extended pupils might be explained as a mild DMT effect due to the result of hyperconnectivity in the brain due to abnormal maturity of the brain. The study doesn't include the age of the subjects. The data was collected from blood and urine samples in the CSF, where the pineal gland directly deposits the compounds produced. So I'm doubtful the subjects actually were taking psychedelics. I'm highly doubtful. Definitely didn't happen. Okay, that's another theory that wasn't considered. All right, I'm not going to read all of that, but that is a very, very interesting study. And again, we use a range of sources here. We don't always use traditional academic sources. This is our autism Reddit forum, but I find that Reddit's quite good for getting anecdotes. So there's the science side of things. Sometimes we get into the anecdotal side of things just to see other people's experiences, to see what happens in scientific modeling as opposed to what happens in everyday life. That's generally the purpose of anecdotes. Okay. There's a source there. Based on my interpretation of the study, the facts predominantly supports the notion that a malfunction of the pineal gland is a consequence of autism rather than a contributing factor. If this research leads to preventing some autistic symptoms in infant autistics, I wholeheartedly support it. However, if it results in identifying a biological marker in embryos, potentially leading to abortion as a preventative measure, I consider it a form of genocide. That's a very interesting comment. And then there's this. If they think we have too much DMT, they might try some dangerous home remedies. And here's the other side of the arguments. I always worry when I see research making the rounds about autism and endogenous tryptamines, DMT, and bufotenine. I think researchers see an opportunity to publish the sensationalist title that will put in lots of people from the general public. I think it's great. They'll probably get more grant money for future research as a result. Okay, so it's a marketing ploy. Potentially a marketing ploy, but meanwhile, lots of autistic folk get very excited about material they don't have context to understand. Yeah, because it's all gatekept. There's been a decent look in the differences in tryptamine synthesis and metabolism in autistic people for decades now. We produce small amounts of these substances, but most are rapidly metabolized, and much of it seems to play a relatively boring role in cell signaling in the GI tract. Their relationship to our brains outside of development is not as relevant as a lot of people in the community want to think, or like, because it feeds into the ego of uniqueness there, the identity of I am separate from you, I am a separate species from you, therefore I am more unique than you. That identitarianism, I think it's just a stepping stone to better scientific understanding of one molecular marker for autism. There's probably not some grand relationship between autism and microdosing on our own DMT. Maybe not microdosing, but there's some form of positive correlation there. So I don't think I would underplay it. Okay, I'm going to have to read some more journal articles, because this is when, again, this is going to sound a lot like pseudoscience, but this is another journal article nonetheless. This is the updated view on the relationship between the pineal gland and entities. Now, this is when we get into woo-woo territory. So again, the National Library of Medicine is where I got these journal articles from. Frontiers in Endocrinology. This is a 2019 study published on the 5th of February. There's a DOI number there by, this is the same study as before. Tal Shormat near Nashad. That sounds like the same study as before. Let's look for the, that's the same study. Never mind. Sorry, guys, my mistake. Let's go into the study here with another article, again from the National Library of Medicine, published by PubMed. This is, we're not reading the full thing, we're only reading the abstract here anyway. Survey of entity encounter. So now we are entering woo-woo territory. Into woo-woo territory we enter. Survey of entity encounter experiences occasioned by inhaled NN, dimethyltryptamine, phenomenology, interpretation, and enduring effects. And this article is published by Alan K. Davis, John M. Clifton, Eric G. Weaver, Ethan S. Hurwitz, Matthew W. Johnson, Roland R. Griffiths. So basically, the background is that experiences of having an encounter with seemingly autonomous entities are sometimes reported after inhaling NN, dimethyltryptamine, and the study characterized the phenomenon, interpretation, and persisting changes people attribute to NN, dimethyltryptamine, occasioned entity encounter experiences. 2,561 individuals completed an online survey about the most memorable entity encounter after taking an N-dimethyltryptamine. So basically, the results were that respondents reported primary senses involved in the encounter were visual and extrasensory, being telepathic. As an example, the most common being descriptive labels for the entity were being guide, spirit, alien, and helpers. Although 41% of respondents reported fear during the encounter, the most prominent emotions, both in the respondent and attributed to the entity, were love, kindness, and joy. Most respondents endorsed that the entity had the attributes of being conscious, intelligent, and benevolent, existed in some real but different dimension of reality or perception of reality, either one, and continued to exist after the encounter. Respondents endorsed receiving a message, 69%, or a prediction of the future, 19%, from the experience. More than half of those who identified as atheists before the experience no longer identified as atheist afterwards. The experiences were rated among the most meaningful, spiritual, psychologically insightful lifetime experiences with persisting positive changes in life satisfaction, purpose, and meaning attributed to the experiences. So basically, DMT, occasioned entity encounter experiences, have many similarities to non-drug entity encounter experiences, such as those described in religious, alien abduction, and near-death contexts. Aspects of the experience and its interpretation produced profound and enduring ontological changes in worldview. So that's a pretty interesting study. Back to me. Let's go back to another study here. This is another journal article yet again. Oh, hello, Lazarus. How you doing, man? DMT for short. Terence McKenna spoke about it. Psilocybin has the same effect. Interesting. Okay, that I didn't know about psilocybin because it shows, what I know about this stuff. I haven't had a field test. I haven't had a field test, but I'm getting towards my model of society here as to why this happens. I think this is the same study. That is the same study. Entity encounters. Okay, that's the same study. Please ignore. Oh. But it is interesting that Terence McKenna actually wrote about this because, again, that's something I wasn't aware of. Now, the reason why I did this stream is to propose my model of society. This is not a conclusive model. This is a working model as to why people do what they do to the neurodivergent and the autistic types. So my working model of society is that the 1% on the top, and this work also is heavily inspired by Thomas Sheridan, so that's not my original thought, just so you know. Thomas Sheridan has covered this in extensive detail. I am only adding to the model. 1% of people to 4.5% of people are psychopaths. With narcissism, it's a little bit high. It's higher. My estimate is about 15 to 30%. So basically, the narcissists crave admiration and they have a sense of grandiosity, but in a different sense. They crave admiration and recognition from others in such a way where I need to manipulate you, but you are my supply to fuel my ego to feel good. For the most part, most, I'm not saying all, most narcissists tend not to be violent. So empathy itself is lowered, but it's lowered because the other human being is viewed as a form of supply. With the psychopath, it's totally different in the sense that the means to the ends are different. I am going to charm you because I've had an experience with a psychopath actually the previous week, and it was a female psychopath too, I might add. But basically, even from my experience, the flattery and the charm is a total mask. It is bullshit. It is a total mask, and it's I'm going to charm and woo you because you are useful to me. I want money, I want power, I want influence, I want sex, I want something from you, basically. But my amygdala doesn't work properly, therefore I don't really feel remorse for what I do. I don't give a shit. With clinical studies into the narcissists, narcissists actually were able to feel remorse. But normally after the social consequences of the supply had dried up, with the psychopath, the remorse tended not to be there. But bearing in mind, psychopathy is a spectrum. So some psychopaths can actually feel remorse, but it's most likely to be very asynchronous, a bit like the autistics. So I'm going to get to that. And then you have the so-called normies and conformies. Basically, I've lumped the narcissists in together with the neurotypicals because they function generally neurotypically anyway. And this is the 98% of the populace. And then down here at the bottom, and this is another quote unquote black pill for people who want to date or seek power if you're on the autism spectrum. You're not a freak. Genetically speaking, you are not a freak. But statistically speaking, you are a freak. Basically, you are 1%, like the psychopaths is the 1% here on the top. But unlike them, you tend to be the 1% at the bottom because you're not like the other 98% and you don't have the social capital of the other 90% derived from the 1% which can leverage this against this. And that's my new working model of psychopathy, autism, and the neurotypical, the neurodivergent archetypes. Because again, if we are to go back into the studies of DMT, people with autism may possibly have, through the dysfunction of the pineal gland, they may have higher access to levels of DMT just by default. And on an existential level, we did say that autism exists because it is a form of a mutation of the human experience. We're here to help evolve the human experience, whether it's positive or negative. That doesn't matter because nature is indifferent. The evidence is that autism exists within the 3D anyway. And then this plays back into the power structure. If, and my working hypothesis is, if autistic hallucinations are actually derived from DMT, it is possible that autists can at times, like the shamans of the past, see the energy bodies and the entities behind the psychopathic structure, which is why this can challenge this, and why the psychopaths, the normies and conformies, and the narcissists tends to bully the neurodivergent and people on the spectrum. So that's my working theory of the occult, human existence, and the power structure. Thank you, Lazarus. Thank you. It's my pleasure having you on the stream watching. So that's my working hypothesis. So bye for now, everyone. That's the end of the stream. Unfortunately, I couldn't film this the way that I wanted to film this with edits. My video editing software license expired, so I'm just going to have to wait for me to film this in, like nice video format with edits and music and visuals and all of that. But Humanus Invictus, the human spirit is never conquered, even if you're the neurodivergent 1%. Trust me, I am. And another theory that I have as well, I didn't cover this in the stream, is that elements of the autism diagnosis somehow correlate with aspects of psychopathy, not in the sense that the amygdala itself has like higher gray matter there, and that the amygdala itself is inactive, like in psychopaths, but in the sense that the brain waves of a different part of the brain, and again, I'm not a neurological expert, is the empathy circuit, or the center of the brain which registers the information to create empathy in the autistic brain, the someone with ASD, is lowered, but it's not lowered to the same level of a psychopath, I find. And maybe it's possible that psychopathy and autism, they know how to read each other. And this is when my anecdote comes into play. Last week, I did encounter what I believe to be a female psychopath. And in the first encounter that she had with me, she was in my workplace. She basically told me that you are interesting, you were not like the others. It was the weirdest offhand comment that I've ever had, and it was right off the bat. I'd never met this individual before, and she had this super serious black look in her eye, like what was that serial killer? Erin Caffey. I think her name was Erin Caffey. She had a very similar look to the Erin Caffey interview where she was feigning sympathy and remorse, but then she would quickly snap up like that. And this I like legit from my personal life experience. This woman did the same thing. The female psychopath in my workplace, and she herself, she was very charming, very seductive. She was like a vixen one moment, and then she'd play the hopeless, innocent Christian the next, and then she'd be back on the other spectrum in the workplace. Vixen one moment, very charming, and then she'd wear like very seductive clothing, very flirty, tried to create a relationship with me outside of work. But it was bullcrap because she had no intention of creating a relationship with me outside of work. And what I found interesting was I made it abundantly clear that I had nothing to offer. I still live at home with one of my parents. I don't have a strong family structure. I'm, financially building myself still. It's been a while, but I've been financially building myself for a while and trying to start a business on the side, which is why most of my money has gone towards technology and things like that, licensing and, accounting certificates and things like that. And then she was quite friendly, like very, very friendly, even towards the other colleagues of mine. And then another strange behavior that she had, apart from, she used drug use, very impulsive. Her behavior was not controlled at all. But what I found interesting was she then quit my workplace, encouraged me to quit my workplace to then tell me that she wanted me to basically help lead her or mentor her. That's about as much as I'm going to say with my work-related information, because this is very recent. But then she would actually quit the other place early to come into my workplace, hang out with her friends, the other peers of hers, and still try to do these like seductive behaviors and these charming behaviors, and to try to knock me off balance when I was working. And what I would do is I would just be indifferent to her as much as I could, and then just basically delegate tasks to her with her peers. But on Tuesday, her behavior totally changed. She appeared into my workplace one last time, and she herself joked in that month that I knew her, joked that she was a psychopath once or twice. I laughed it off because I thought she was being ironic. I thought she was actually joking. I'm like, you're just joking, you're being ironic, or you're just pulling my leg, good one, good one. You got quite a good sense of humor there. But the third and the fourth time that she said she was a psychopath, again, back to the Erin Caffey interview, she had that same look in her eye. I kid you not. And then she changed. Her energy changed in an instant. And it was nothing short of sheer hatred. And it was like a hatred that I've never seen in someone before, with the exception of one time when I was in a church. You don't have to believe me on this anecdote. I happened to come across a Protestant type of church where a boy was actually possessed, and I saw it with my own eyes. I don't care if I'm not believed on this channel. He threw a 40-something, I think about 42, 43-year-old woman praying over this boy across the room without physically touching her. They were like that far apart, at least, if not further. And this five-year-old boy with the same black look at his eye goes like this, does that, and pushes this woman who's probably like 5 or 6 times his size and body weight without physically touching her with his arms. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. And the level of hatred from this woman matched the same level of hatred from the possessed boy. Not the boy himself, but the entity behind him. So that's a very interesting anecdote that I had experienced this particular week. On Tuesday, I got discarded. She went from charming and seductive to, you make me uncomfortable. Fine, fine, I'll give her space, in which I did. Blocked her contacts, physically moved away. She moved on to the other workplace anyway. But what I found was strange is that she would still stalk me on social media until I blocked her on Instagram and WhatsApp. And she wanted to stay in the chat group despite leaving the workplace that I was at for the, helping the other people, my other colleagues for the group. And it was by far the most bizarre, comedic, clownish behavior. And what's so ironic about the mask was that the behavior itself was so comedic that it put me in a state of cognitive dissonance. But the end of my encounter with this particular female psychopath is that I was in shock for like 2 or 3 days. And I was asking myself, did I really encounter a female psychopath? She exhibited that sign, grandiosity, a need for control, a need for control for means to an ends, but not necessarily for her own ego, because she wasn't in it for her own ego. She had grandiosity already. But she couldn't get power, money, influence, resources out of me. Okay, so then that rules out physical benefits then. What does she want? To connect with someone. Okay. But what I realized then was that the whole thing was a game to her, because this person had a business background as well. They fitted the business leader archetype with an MBA. They had an actual Masters of Business Administration, this individual. But what I realized is that it was all a game to them. They were telling me indirectly in their own way that they were bullshitting and that I was manipulable, which I was. And then that in and of itself made me realize that it was about chaos. It was about chaos and impulse and control. It was not about the physical resources after all. And then after the Tuesday, she went stone cold and discarded me like this. But she didn't block me. I blocked her. So that's it with the power structure. It was a very interesting encounter which inspired me to create this working model and this stream. So as always, Humanus Invictus, the human spirit is not conquered. Bye for now, everyone, and take care. And just remember, keep your head on a swivel. These individuals, male and female, do exist. Be wise with your energy, be wise with your mind, your body, your heart, your soul, and look beyond. There are forces beyond our control that we just simply don't understand, and sometimes they appear as individuals. The other crazy thing was I was grieving for a charming friend which didn't exist at the end of this encounter, and I was drained basically all week. I've been drained of energy all week. So make of that of what you will. Just protect yourselves and take care.